There were many armies that achieved great conquests and military feats during the Middle Ages. Some of them even gained a reputation for invincibility. Who has not heard of the exploits of Richard the Lionheart's English during the Third Crusade, or the charges of the Norman cavalry of William I the Conqueror? Who would dare to face the white companies of Beltran Duguesclin, or the agile African troops of the Almogavars? To give a final example, what military force in medieval times enjoyed the discipline and courage of the Templars, who had so many impossible victories? Undoubtedly, all the previous ones were formidable war machines, but none achieved as many victories as those obtained by our protagonists today. In addition, and unlike the most famous medieval armies, the strength of our army resided in the infantry. We are referring to the Almogavar company, composed of the most fearsome, most fearless, and craziest warriors of all times. During medieval times, their name resounded from the Pyrenean peaks to the confines of the Mediterranean, always carrying victory with them. But the Almogavars were not a military corps created by a king. On the contrary, their formation developed pragmatically in the heat of the Spanish Reconquest. Their name means in Arabic, "he who causes ambushes," and they were mountain men and warriors of fortune who attacked the Muslims. Probably, they were born as small armed bands that acted in an autonomous way, and that made of the rapine their way of life, arriving to make deep incursions in enemy territory. The Almogavars were, in essence, people who lived on the frontier and from the frontier, but the frontier in the Middle Ages was not a well-defined line on a map, but a wide strip of land in which no one had power. It was an area of inhospitable forests, steep ravines, and high mountain ranges, a den of wolves and bandits, a land of raids and ambushes, where one could gain fame or lose one's life. In medieval Spain, there were many such frontiers, and one of the hardest was the one between the Muslims and the Kingdom of Aragon, at the foot of the Pyrenees. Those who managed to take control of that frontier and organised themselves to prosper in it were called Almogavars. The Almogavars are the counterpoint of their time. In a time of loyalties, they owed no more loyalty than to their equals. In the time of heavy cavalry, they fought on foot and with hardly any weapons or armour, and yet their time was not alien to them. Such was their combat efficiency that the bold kings of Aragon soon took notice of them. The latter, in need of resources to push the borders of the kingdom to the south, ended up using the Almogavars as mercenaries in their service. From then on, they became elite forces of the Aragonese troops, carrying out all kinds of suicidal operations. The Almogavar company had just been born, and their first great exploit took place in Sicily. At the height of the 13th century, the kings of Aragon finally reached the Mediterranean, but they were ambitious for more and jumped into the sea. Their goal was Sicily, which is strategically located in the centre of the Mediterranean, south of Italy. The island has been seized by Charles of Anjou, thanks to the support of the Pope, but the Sicilians did not take kindly on such foreign domination. Therefore, on March 30th, 1282, the Sicilians rose up violently against the French. That slaughter of the French has gone down in history as Sicilian Vespers. It was a terrible event, but Charles of Anjou was not willing to give up the island, so the Sicilians called for the help of the King of Aragon, Peter III. And why the King of Aragon? It was no coincidence. As Peter aspired to dominate the island, he had previously married Constance, who was the daughter of the last Sicilian king, before the arrival of the French. Consequently, Peter of Aragon had legitimate rights to the Sicilian throne. The impetuous King Peter did not hesitate. He sent to Sicily a large contingent of Almogavars, who disembarked in Palermo at the end of August and marched to liberate Messina, besieged by the French. According to Desclot's chronicle, they were dirty, bearded, blackened, and ragged men, without the presence of knights. When the people of Messina saw them, they were frustrated, believing themselves lost, but the Almogavars inflicted about 10,000 casualties on the French, and the French had to lift the siege. In a short time, Sicily was free of the French, and the King of Aragon added Sicily to his crown, thanks to the Almogavars. This did not please the Pope, who was the great ally of the French. Angry, he excommunicated King Peter and dispossessed him of the kingdom, offering Aragon to the son of the King of France. He also gave the expedition against Aragon the status of a crusade. Suddenly, King Peter found himself facing the great powers of his time, the French, the Crusaders, and the Pope. And in spite of everything, he was victorious. Once the crusade had stalled, and the French turned back to their place of origin, thousands of Almogavars assaulted them through the Pyrenean passes. Finally, at the Collado de las Peninsas, they smashed the papal army. The Almogavars jumped on the Crusaders, striking their weapons with flint until sparks flew, while uttering their peculiar war cry, "Aragon, Aragon, awaken Pharaoh." Even the Pope's legate died soon after, due to the panic created by those savage ambushes. But it was not in Sicily nor in Spain where the Almogavars carved their immortal fame. Their great journey took place in Anatolia. In 1302, 20 years after the fighting in Sicily, the company remained idle on the island, while in the east, the empire of the Byzantium was crumbling in the face of the unstoppable advance of the Turks. The Almogavars needed work, and the Byzantines needed good warriors. The fate of both was linked. Thus, in August of that same year, 10,000 Almogavars and some knights set sail for Constantinople. That force is known as the Great Almogavar Company, and at its head we find one of the most fascinating military leaders of the Middle Ages, the Italian Roger de Flor, who was the perfect captain for these warriors. Roger was skillful, brave, and had been educated at sea by the Templars, even gaining command of a ship of the Templar fleet, the Falcon. But after his performance in the tragic fall of Acre, where the slaughter created chaos among the Christians who tried to flee, the Templars accused him of stealing treasures of the order, and he fled to avoid a severe trial. From then on, the Italian would no longer fear anything except the Templars. Having become the leader of the Almogavars, his march to Byzantium was a flight forward. Roger preferred to face the Turks rather than be taken prisoner by the Templars. The Great Almogavar Company was warmly received by Emperor Andronicus II in Constantinople, but the Turks were nearby, and very soon they found themselves face to face. In the first battle, the large Turkish army suffered 13,000 casualties, and by virtue of such a victory, the Almogavars soon regained Philadelphia, Magnesia, and Ephesus. But the Turks soon recovered from the blow. The decisive battle between the two forces took place at Monte Taro on August 15th, 1304. According to the chronicler Raymond Muntaner, who accompanied the Almogavars on the expedition to Byzantium, that day 5,000 Almogavars faced nearly 40,000 Turks. The ratio was terrible, 1 to 8, and against all odds, they won. Shouting and making sparks fly, they pounced on the Turks and a brutal battle began. The Almogavars used to run headlong into the enemy, charges and throw their spears hard at the horses, knocking them down. Then, they would go into the enemy ranks and slash and spear left and right to break the enemy lines. Their aim was to create panic and provoke disbandment in order to prey on the retreating army. At Monte Taro, after a day of desperate fighting, the Turkish troops also retreated, leaving about 18,000 men on the field. The Almogavars did not remember such carnage. After that, Roger de Flor's company liberated the entire Anatolian Peninsula from the Turkish threat. They then fixed their base of operations on the Gallipoli Peninsula and arranged to spend the winter there and reorganise. The Almogavars had defeated the Muslims in Spain, the French in Sicily, and the Turks in Anatolia. Roger de Flor did not imagine what their new threat would be, but it would not be long in coming. His victories over the Turks earned Roger de Flor the pompous title of Megaduke. In addition, the Byzantine Emperor Andronicus granted him the hand of Mary, daughter of the Tsar of Bulgaria. Everything was going wonderfully, but the campaign was not over yet. Shortly thereafter, the Almogavars again faced the Turks in the monumental battle of the Sicilian Gates, where they faced an army of 30,000 men. Surprisingly, the mercenaries won again, and their fame soared. The Turks lost in that day almost 2/3 of their forces. From this moment on, the Turks ceased to be a threat, and Roger was given an even greater title, that of Caesar. Except for the cities, all the land of Anatolia became his fiefdom. His dizzying rise seemed to have no limit. Overnight, Roger de Flor was one of the most important personalities of the Byzantine Empire, but the ambition of the Italian, as well as his growing power, ended up arousing the suspicions of Michael IX, the son and heir of Emperor Andronicus. Michael feared that the upstart might displace him from the throne and plotted a betrayal against the Almogavars. After all, now that the Turks were no longer in danger, he had no need of them, who were nothing more than a burden to the empire, a source of conflict for the population and a threat to himself. Then, on April 5th, 1305, Michael invited Roger and the main chiefs of the great Almogavar company to a great banquet in Adrianople, under the pretext of celebrating their victories. That would be the sad goal of the adventurer, who had forged himself on the seas, and who had succeeded in liberating Byzantium from the Turks. There, during the celebration, Alano mercenaries in the service of the emperor burst into the hall and murdered Roger of Flower and all his commanders. It was a terrible betrayal, but Miguel believed that it dispatched all his fears and problems with a stroke of a pen. And yet he was wrong. He had just unleashed the wrath of the Almogavars, who, despite suffering a cruel persecution and having lost their chiefs, managed to regroup in Gallipoli. From there would begin what was gone down in history as Almogavar revenge. Harassed, decimated, and without commanders, the surviving Almogavars held an assembly behind the city walls. Some argued that the best option was to flee to Sicily, which was easy since the peninsula had access to the sea and they kept their ships. Others, however, proposed using the fleet to plunder the shores of the Byzantine Empire. Finally, the supporters of Bernat de Roquefort defended the need to avenge the betrayal of the Byzantines. The latter was the chosen alternative. Thus, the last Almogavars imprisoned in Gallipoli ordered 4 banners to be made, one of St. George, another of St. Peter, another of Sicily, and another of Aragon. There were only 5,000 men, and they were going to face the force of 40,000 Byzantine soldiers marching against them. In June 1305, the Byzantines set up camp in front of the city walls, cornered in the narrow peninsula of Gallipoli. But what the attackers did not imagine was that the besieged would come out to battle outside the city. On the evening of June 7th, the Almogavars opened the gates and pounced on the unsuspecting Byzantine army. "Aperta ferro," they shouted, as they made sparks fly from their weapons. They immediately created chaos among the enemy ranks, and a desperate retreat began, which allowed the Almogavars to exploit their coup d'etat. Thousands of Byzantines died, but the Almogavars continued to advance, and 3 days later, they fell by surprise on the rear of the reinforcement army in Acros. There, they also destroyed the Byzantine force. The company then began a terrifying march that would take them to the very gates of Constantinople, razing and annihilating everything in their path. Every time they approached a city, the inhabitants took cover behind its walls and closed the gates, watching the Almogavars pass before them in panic and helplessness. The whole of Anatolia trembled under the wrath of those warriors, who had just a short time before liberated that land from the Turkish army. Of course, their revenge would not end until they had killed all the Alano mercenaries who had murdered Roger of Flor and the rest of the company's commanders in Adrianople. The epic climax of the Almogavar journey would take place in Greece, where they were hired by the Duke of Athens. The company fought there successfully, but once again, the Duke refused to pay them. Consequently, the Almogavars faced the Duke's famous Frankish cavalry at the Battle of the River Seviso on March 16th, 1311. As usual, they were outnumbered, supported only by a contingent of Turkish allies, but that did not discourage them. On the contrary, they diverted the course of the river Seviso upstream of Lake Kupade, flooding the entire plain that opened before them. Previously, they ploughed the fields so that the water would soak them well. When the large Frankish cavalry appeared, covering the horizon with metal-clad knights, the Turks were afraid and fled from the field, but the Almogavars remained in their positions. Then, the Frankish cavalry charged against them, making the earth tremble, but upon reaching the boggy puddles, their horses sank deep into the mud and lost their shock force. Immediately, the Franks launched a second wave of cavalry, although it met the same fate as the first. It was the turn of the Almogavars. The mercenaries threw themselves on the Franks, and a terrible massacre began. Trapped in the mud in their heavy armour, the Franks were easy prey for the skilled Almoravid warriors, who stabbed and skewered them with their spears. The Turks, seeing how the tables were turned, then returned to the battlefield and also charged the Franks, whose cavalry was almost entirely annihilated. As a consequence of the Battle of the River Cephiso, the Almogavars took possession of the Duchy of Athens, and shortly after, the Duchy of Neopatria. The Pope excommunicated them, but they surrendered both territories to the King of Aragon. Thus, and for almost half a century, the ensign with the bars of Aragon waved next to the famous Parthenon of Athens. It was at the end of that century precisely when the chronicler Desclo dared to affirm that even the fish of the Mediterranean carried the bars of Aragon on their fins. Although in a poetic way, Desclo was referring to the enormous Aragonese dominion over the sea, which was possible, in part, thanks to the Almogavars. The deeds of the great Almogavar company seemed to be the fruit of legend, but they were history. More than one chronicler accompanied those singular warriors throughout the wide world, leaving a record of their exploits, and even today, the mark of the Almogavar revenge remains in the form of proverbs and folktales in present-day Turkey. If they managed to defeat so many traditional armies, it was in part because the Almogavars responded to a different concept of war. They were a professional army and contributed to the rise of the modern mercenary forces that during the late Middle Ages began to replace the traditional feudal troops, which were less effective and much more difficult to raise and manage.
And this is the end of the video, like a great night at the theatre introducing the main protagonists. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and leave a comment about what other character, battle, event, or historical curiosity you would like us to cover. I hope you enjoyed the video as much as we did. See you in a few days. Bye!